Welcome back to the Football Fitness Federation podcast. This is episode 207. I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast today by first team sports scientist at Watford, Lee Stafford. Lee, how are we?
All good. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
No problem at all, mate. This has been a long time coming, this one, hasn't it? We've been back and forth trying to fit it in. We've finally managed it. So thank you very much for coming on, mate.
No problem. Thanks for having me, mate.
Let's kick it off, Lee. I've just mentioned your current title, First Team Sports Science at Watford, but can you take us back? Can you give us the journey that led up to that role?
Yeah, for sure. So I think with all sports science and strength and conditioning, I actually started as an intern. So I was fortunate enough to go down to Bournemouth. So I worked as a placement student at Bournemouth and predominantly worked in the academy. I worked with Ben Bradley, who was the head of sports science, and at the time, it was actually just himself running it. So, you know, when I started with him, he'd given me a lot of responsibility straight off the bat. You know, fresh in university still, and really keen and eager to, you know, help the program and learn under him. Had a fantastic year there. Learned absolute tons. And you know, in terms of sports science and conditioning. And his avenue was maturation, so it was the perfect way to start, in my opinion. And obviously, reflecting back on it, it was a great year. Taught me a lot in terms of values, hard work, ethic, and obviously, you know, a good foundation. After that, I went back to my third year of university, and applied for an internship at Watford, just because I needed the experience just to progress on. Worked with Peter Sharp there, and he was fantastic with me as well. I was first team as well for that internship, and also taught me a completely different set of skills. From then, I was just graduating, and they offered me an interview for the under-21s role that they were opening up. Managed to get that and did 2 years of work with the under-21s, worked with some really good coaches. Same with Pete Sharp. You know, taught me a lot in the first few years, and obviously in the first few years you're starting out and sort of learning the trade a little bit more. And it was fantastic, really. And since then, the first team had asked me then to move up. So this is now my 5th season working in the first team. And yeah, in terms of what I've covered so far has been excellent. I started with rehabs and started with gym prescription and similar things, and then moved on to you know, detailed load monitoring, and then now sort of helping to plan the weeks as they go, load prescription, alterating loads, and likewise, you know, other challenges.
Brilliant. And you said about obviously getting experience at academy, then under-21s, then first team, and some of the skills that you learned along that way. How did they differ? Because this is something we spoke about a lot on the podcast. Like, how did they differ from academy to first team to 21s? Like, what were the different skills you developed?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you start working in an academy, you know, you think that the standard might be easier, but it's a completely different set of skills. You have to have a few more soft skills at the start. You know, relationships with trying to work with players at different ages. You know, the attention span of a 9-year-old is completely different to an attention span of an under 18. So I think it's just your basic soft skills, really. And then as you work into more sort of like practitioner skills, is learning how to coach different athletes at different levels, how to apply obviously the baseline science and everything, but also just how to make people tick at different levels, understanding load capacity, where people should be in terms of their age groups, how you can individualize, you know, in terms of working with the maturation, and how to individualize in strength on the pitch as they're going through different age brackets. And I think, yeah, when you obviously progress into slightly older athletes and guys that are in the under-21s, completely different. And that's a whole new challenge in itself. And especially when you are young yourself and you're coaching guys that are 2-3 years younger than you, you know, there's that sort of, you might not be taken seriously at first, so you have to get that right. And that's what I found in like my early career was, understanding the athlete, having the soft skills to approach them, to get them to do, the exact programs you want, and, how to approach them as people as well as athletes.
Because I know obviously there's hard skills involved in each of those levels as well that we need to develop as practitioners. And I'm sure people know the differences between sort of academy and first team, but just on that as well, was there a time when you were working with those different ages when you got that exposure where you were like, no, it's first team where I want to be because, well, whatever reason that was?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I started working in the under 18s at Bournemouth, I really enjoyed my time there. But I sort of not wanted more, but I sort of wanted to work with the guys who were, doing this day in, day out, and, performing on a Saturday. It mattered, they were really professional about their jobs. Not that the young guys weren't, but it was just a whole step above in terms of how elite, the first team lads are. And I think through that journey, when you work with the under 21s, the difference when they train with the first team, and that sort of made me think, okay, now I want to work with obviously the best level of elite athlete I can. And that's not, to shoot anyone down, because, for me, that's my personal preference in working in first team football. And I can completely see why people work in academy football. But that was sort of the recognition of why I thought, I want to work with the first team players, because I also think my skill set can work better with that as well.
Yeah, 100%. No, it's an important thing, especially for young coaches to hear, isn't it? There's not one way or one career path for coaches. I think it's being aware, like you've just mentioned, of your skill set, but also what is required at those different age groups as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the academy coaches that I've come across are fantastic, and some of them are leaps and bounds above me because they have a completely different skill set, and some of them don't want to work in first team football because it's not all about working with the highest level. That just felt like my skill set was tailored to working with those personalities slightly more. And like I said, I've worked with some fantastic people that I probably will never get near their careers in academy football.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, you mentioned about how your role was transitioned over time, so more of a rehab focus initially, and then now looking more into. I'm trying to not use load monitoring, because Matt Taberner at our recent meeting was talking about training prescription. So I'm trying to get myself into this phrase of training prescription, but I'm definitely going to keep saying load monitoring. But essentially that, looking into data and prescribing load for players as well. So where did that come from? Where did that transition come from? Was that changes in staff? Was that just naturally how things transitioned? How did that come about?
So initially, when I was working in the under 21s, you take more of like a global approach with working with the strength and conditioning programs, the nutrition, and the load monitoring, with load prescription as well. Two different things on a different edge. But when I went into the first team, we had a predominant fitness coach who would monitor the load, and would ask me to help with sort of the day-to-day, like the low level processing. And then from that would ask my opinion, what I thought, how the team looked, and various different drill analysis. And from that, we sort of had a small team with us that, we would always confer and talk about and say, okay, maybe we need to improve this or change that. Then through the years, probably a year and a half later, started working with one of our data scientists. And one of the data scientists, he was fantastic, very good guy, very good at his job. Then he moved on. And from that, it was almost sort of like handed to me to take over in that aspect. And 2.5 years later, I'm still doing it and still working with, whether that may be the fitness coach that comes in or one of us guys that will help out with the manager in order to improve that process. So
Real. And then in terms of how you go about monitoring, but also amending this prescription for players across, we were just talking before we started recording about this season and all the challenges that you're facing. I'm sure the whole planning in pencil comes into play and having to amend things all the time. So what are some key factors that influence that?
Yeah, for sure. I think one thing we're quite big on is different load groups. So the guys that are obviously in high match minutes, the guys that are coming on and playing maybe 30, 45 minutes a game or there or thereabouts. And then you've got the guys that don't play. I think managing those schedules is really important. So we usually tend to have like a load prescription for the week that we want guys to try and follow, and that then falls into categories of A, B, and C. So the guys that, you know, are the match minutes guys that are playing two games a week, they almost speak for themselves. We rarely have to amend that. Some training days they miss for an extra day, but then we try and top them up in a different way. Likewise, the B group that plays some minutes, we then have to manage that in between games. And likewise, the C group. You know, it depends on the match day, the next week, the previous week, the chronic load, and the phase that they're about to go into. So we like to obviously have everyone prepared always for you know, a 90-minute match at least. You know, sometimes having guys ready for double game weeks consistently. You know, sometimes it's tough when you haven't got a minute in the tank, or some of the guys haven't played minutes for, you know, 2-3 weeks, and you're trying to get extra sessions and extra strength sessions. It is tough, but I think you have to look at your periodization model, look at the fixtures, and try and incorporate the best way of loading them high enough to then deload them on certain days to then spike, and then obviously I say spike to increase their load. Whereas I think the match guys are almost like self-sufficient in some sort of way.
And in terms of those minutes when you've got players not completing full games and there's going to be different minutes involved with those sorts of players, do you have a set structure you revert to, or is it taking it case by case with each player?
So typically we would have sort of like baselines and like prescriptive loads that we want the guys to hit week to week. So usually we would adapt the training load or the training session or the top-up sessions relative to that. For example, if we had a soft -1 or -2, we might throw different elements of conditioning in there, likewise on the match day after the game. So depending on how the last sort of 2-3 days have looked, we might then try and sort of work the opposite to the last 2-3 days to increase different conditioning strategies, whether that be more extensive high speeds, more like HML efforts, more intermittent sprints, and we would sort of adjust that. So we look at the training load of the guys probably 5-6 times a week, because we more or less know what happens, you know, on certain days. But for the rest of the days, we're trying to just keep them in almost like a sweet spot, but not a sweet spot, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. Our community members have a lot of discussions around sort of top up runs and structuring those and the way they go about them. Like, what tends to be your approach to that?
Yeah, I think it's sort of dependent like on your schedule and your structures. Obviously we know that they're not the easiest session to complete. So we try and make it fairly short and sweet. So we basically call it a cocktail Molotov, where they basically work 3 different blocks, and all of these 3 different blocks have a portion of high speed, sprint, HMO efforts, accel, decel, and various other metrics. So we almost cram a running block together, and based on your minute approach, you're then given 1, 2, or 3 blocks. And this is almost just like an accepted value now. You know, for example, you're going to get 15-minute portion of the game, you're even going to get a 30-minute portion of the game, or you're going to get a 45-minute portion of the game, or, you know, based on a different day, maybe more. But that's how we've sort of worked it.
Okay, Brill. Nice. There'll be plenty. We'll be trying to replicate that, I'm sure. Just on the data side of things, Lee, as well. Again, this is a conversation we've had a lot. There's a lot we can collect. There's a lot out there. How do you go about prioritizing what you're going to use and what's going to make real impact to your approach?
Yeah, for sure. I think that's something that obviously when you're monitoring and looking at obviously the training sessions, you do have to sort of figure out yourself. But something that we've sort of gravitated towards was having a set weekly structure of metrics. So we look at the periodization in, for example, 8 metrics, and you can obviously see the undulations and obviously the peaks in some days and whatnot. But we also try and look at key metrics for certain days. So on a -4, we might have completely different analysis metrics relative to a -2, because we're not aiming to hit, for example, on the -2, loads of high metabolic load efforts. So we don't want the repeated sprint ability. We don't want those intermittent exercises. We want sort of steady pace, low level tapering strategy. Whereas on a -4, we want it really intensive, loads of high metabolic load efforts, some repeated sprint ability, and sort of we cater and look for different metrics on different days. Likewise, when we analyze certain drills, we would look, relatively in terms of meters per minute, how the lads are relative to their match performance, and then obviously map that in different drills. But we've actually started to, over the past year and a half, is map different metrics against each other. So I started working with Miguel Angel Campos, fantastic guy, and he sort of opened up this sort of like vision and on Tableau, and he's got some fantastic ideas that I've started to play around with now, and for me it's fantastic going on Tableau and inventing different ways to view the metrics and interactions. So we've sort of started, well, he's been doing it a while, but I've sort of started on this pathway now where I might look at metrics relative to each other. So for example, high speed running and high metabolic load efforts, to see if they're correlated, because it's very different if we're working when we've got 400 meters of high speed, but the guys are doing it in 4 efforts. I mean, you can do that in 3 minutes, but we want to work relative to when the guys are working in the match. So some days we might look at the high metabolic load efforts versus the high speed sprint. So therefore we get a good profile of where we are relative to a game.
And then you just mentioned the game there. So in terms of sort of game style, game model, can you give a little bit of breakdown on how the club approach that, and also how that then determines what you do and the approach you take?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously when the manager comes in, we obviously want to mirror and suit his style of play as best as possible. So I think the key conversations around that is obviously understanding the philosophy, the methodology, when the aggression comes in the physical outputs, when to press, when to recover. So we try and map that in drills, and we're quite lucky that the manager plays in a lot of relative drills in terms of where the guys are on the pitch. So tactically, which definitely helps, because training absolute in a possession where everyone more or less may have the same metrics is quite tough to push the guys. So we have a very nice system where we train relative in positional specifics. So the guys are getting very good intensity bouts on the -4 and -3 relative to the distances they'll be covering in games, the repeated sprint abilities, everything like this. So getting a lot of specifics in definitely helps us to maintain consistency for each position. So they're, for example, getting 70% of a game throughout the week or something like that, that everyone is more or less at 70% of their match performance because of the relativity in the positional specific training.
And how would you sort of define the game style? I know that there's probably a lot of people that have watched the team this year. Like, What sort of things are jumping out from the technical side that impact what you do?
So I think it's quite interesting because last year our possession and tactical, it was completely different to this year. This year, we're a possession-based team, and sort of in our physical eyes, we want to be really, capable of extensive sprints, counter-attacks, as well as obviously utilizing patterns as aggressive as possible. But from that, we then just try and push the guys as much as possible, ready for whatever model the manager wants to then, play with that week, whether that means that we're playing a different formation, but always having the guys at a high capacity to sprint, accel, decel, and repeat that over a number of minutes.
Yeah, so there's standards that you're trying to hit regardless, but then you mentioned about being at the club for 5 years. So as well as formation changes and things like that, there's also going to be manager changes along the way. And I don't expect you to sort of name names and dig people out, but in terms of styles, I'm guessing there's been some quite different styles. And how much does that have an impact, or is it a case of you still hitting those basics you're trying to get the players to do?
Yeah, I think styles are massive, obviously, on the physical outputs of the games and what how you analyze the game after. Whereas last year because we weren't pushing high in the table, more or less we were a counter-attacking team, didn't have much possession, especially against big teams. So that massively influences our style of play and massively influences our physical data. So our extensive sprints may not be as many, but we might be having to sprint further. So it depends on how we analyze the games. If we're, for example, doing more extensive recovery runs when we lose possession, or likewise that we're counter-attacking. So in our eyes, we're trying to push the guys as far as possible in terms of how extensive our sprints are. And then also contrast into our repeated sprint ability, obviously to defend. But in our eyes, we try and push them to their physical ceilings regardless. And then however that mirrors in the match performance, then we're happy with, as long as the manager's happy with the physical performance.
And do you see a change when changes happen sort of mid-season, when you're in the flow of things, and maybe unexpected sometimes as well, and then there's different loads that then go on to the players from slightly different demands of styles and things. Do you see a big impact with that, or not so much, and just again reverting back to what you're doing?
Yeah, similarly, to be fair. We've noticed it a little bit this year in the Championship, for example, when we've played a different model and a different style, when we're three at the back. For example, our centre backs don't often sprint in high speeds. And I think that's based on being more of a possession-based team this year, having more of a physical dominance or a dominance in the league. We hope that this may influence how much we have the ball, how many times the guys have to turn, open their shoulders and sprint behind us is completely different to last year. So we've noticed a massive difference in the physicality data from our defenders for sure. But it depends on the system, whether the guys are 4 at the back or 3 and 5 in the middle. It completely depends on how that is situated or how the manager wants them to play that week. But yeah, it differs week to week.
Real. And obviously the other side of data that we just touched on is the analysis, and also presenting things back to coaches and players and all the rest of it. What tends to be your approach with that in terms of that presentation? I know I've spoken to a lot of people that take different approaches. It always depends on coaches and what they want to see, but what tends to be some of the patterns of you presenting that back?
Yeah, so in terms of presentations, we've gone through, several reports in our time, and people want different things. So some people just want basic numbers, which is absolutely fine for us. And they just want to see sort of like a general feedback with, how the guys are comparing against each other. Some want visual feedback, but I think the best way is just to have simplistic feedback and just good visuals that, you can see, for example, relative to match performance, and likewise, then just have like a basic set structure of what they achieved in different metrics. Then for games, we send the lads the report from the team, totals in each area, so that the lads can also see that and just have a bit of transparency. We don't want to keep any data from the lads in terms of, if they've had a great game or a poor game, we're going to report it the same. So having sort of that feedback and transparency is key for us, just to say, for example, okay, we were low on total distance this week, or we were high in sprint values this week. And we sort of want to just remain consistent with the way that we present everything. And if we improve or we decrease one week, then obviously people know that within the team as well. It may be tactical, so we're not looking to hammer anyone or not looking to, pass blame or anything. It is what it is. It's the context of the match. It depends on obviously how the match is going, completely affects the physical data. So you have to take it with a pinch of salt as well sometimes.
And on that as well, do you feel like players are much more well educated on that now, that they understand? You could give them a data point and they'd sort of they understand it a lot better than seeing it as like, oh, whether it be a punishment or whatever, you feeding that back? Like, what's the sort of perspective from a player's point of view?
Yeah, I think it's tough because they know we have weekly loads and prescriptions to hit. So I don't think the lads like the live iPad. So I've had a few balls flying over towards me, especially with that one. But no, in terms of how the lads understand the data, I think they really get it, which does help us. And the lads are always asking for the data, to see individual performances, team performances. And that's not to call anyone out. It's just to have sort of that relation to the game, to see how that was physically for them. So some guys might ask straight after a game, how are my numbers? I want to see it straight away, because they may feel that, tactically they might have been not as on it as the day, and then how that reflects in their data. If they had to do recovery runs, if they're playing against someone superior or inferior against them, how that impacts them. So I think it's at a good point. Most of our lads are bought into it, and they understand, a lot about the data and their high speeds, their sprints, their efforts in games. So I think they're well understood with it.
Awesome. I wanted to touch on something that we just spoke about before we started recording, which I'm sure this conversation is going to come up time and time again over the next few weeks, but the World Cup is fast approaching. What are your sort of thoughts going into that time? Obviously a very weird season with the break mid-season. I know we were talking before about a certain amount of players being away and certain staying. Like, what are your general thoughts around that?
Yeah, so I think obviously for us, we might not have too many going to the World Cup. I think we may have 3, I believe. But from that, obviously, we want to be, transparent with the player and sort of say, look, we should build you a good chronic load going into the World Cup, because you're going to have, a quick turnaround in games. So, I think it's just being honest with the players that are going into the World Cup to say, okay, if we're underloading you, or you're underloaded going into the World Cup, you might have a slightly poorer recovery between games. So for us, maybe that's a conversation that we will have. And in terms of the other guys and the training loads, I think it will be difficult because of the 4 weeks off, or however that may be. So we've had a conversation about it, but obviously we'll sort of have to play it by ear in a certain way, because some guys we might deload, and some guys we might try and obviously peak for the latter part of it, based on how many minutes they've played, their chronic loads that they've achieved. But I think it's so important to have time off and time off the feet as well, because it is a long season. We had 9 games in 4 or 5 weeks, in 5 weeks even. So it's double game weeks pretty much every week. So the guys do need time off, and I think we really, really need to value that as well. not only for the monotony and everything, but for, the mental side of it is, they'll come back in a fresher state, and, appreciate the work more and value sort of the higher sessions in order to get more days off.
And has been any thoughts or even contact from the international associations, coaches around preparing players for the heat over there as well?
At the moment, we haven't had that conversation. In terms of where the guys are at the moment, most of them have gone away with internationals, which does sort of help because they almost have a plan and strategy. But in terms of with us at the moment, we haven't had direct contact with obviously the heat acclimation stuff. But yeah, it's a fantastic way to prep some of the guys, definitely.
It's just how, I suppose, how that falls alongside, because you're going to be playing games right up to when they go, aren't you? So how that sort of falls alongside the normal season whilst preparing for that in the background.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliantly. Really, really appreciate you going through all that, mate. Let's get into some of the quick fire questions that we always finish the podcast with. So the first is, who have been some of the biggest influences on your career so far?
I would say in the early part, definitely Ben Bradley at Bournemouth. He was fantastic for me. Peter Sharp when I came to Watford, and still he's come back now to Watford, so speak with him a lot. Very good guy. I also have a good relationship with Miguel Angel Campos. He helped me a lot with Tableau, and I think that's a skill set that everyone should learn. So I'm very grateful for him showing that work to me, because I know a lot of people, if they have some very, very good work, might not want to share it. But literally he sent me everything, and yeah, it was fantastic for me. So I think those three guys, obviously I've had a lot of great people I've worked with. So, it's hard to name anymore, but hard not to, but yeah.
Real. What would you say your biggest strength is as a practitioner?
So I think understanding the personal side of it. We bang on about load and everything like that, but everyone knows that when you try and get an athlete to sprint or to perform a certain amount of high speed efforts and things like this, that sometimes when it's done at 10% quality, it's actually sometimes not worth it. So understanding the person behind the athlete, and how to get the best out of them, and I feel like we do, and I think that's something that we do quite well, is have good relationships with the guys, and they push for us.
Yeah, that's truly tested on the post-game runs, I suppose, as well, that relationship.
For sure.
I always ask about what your top advice would be. So taking Lee a good few years back now, starting out, what would be your advice to him?
I think I would say to invest more time in sort of my CPD when I was young. I was trying to learn the job and trying to do a lot for myself then and there. But I think getting more qualifications, reading a lot more, would have been some very good advice to a young me. But I think I've started to realize that the more I reflected, so completely changed the way, obviously, that I have been in the last sort of 3-4 years. But yeah, definitely invest in yourself and believe in yourself.
That's really interesting, because a lot of people actually not say it the other way around, but they say how important it is the other way around. The fact that you've got the experience and got into working always tends to be the advice. So you feel like the sort of qualifications and all that side was something that you could have done a bit more of?
It was more, I was lucky enough to get into a role, but I was so focused on working in the role at the time and trying to perfect that I wanted to do a master's, and I was sort of annoyed that I didn't get to do one straight after university. And so maybe I should have started earlier and started on different, accreditations and everything. But I sort of coasted for 2 years just in the job I was in. But I sort of wish that I was working alongside the job. But yeah, it's a tough one, because I do agree, get experience first as much as you can, and then learn along the way. So I wouldn't change a thing.
Awesome. And you just mentioned CPD. So the last question I always ask is what's your approach? How do you go about continually developing as a practitioner?
So I think it was a couple of years ago, we started to develop an internship program here. So with the guys that are here for the year, we give them certain presentations, we run them through certain tests, and then that gives us quite a good opportunity to do roundtables, talk about certain subjects, and basically influence and try and encourage, the teaching aspect from our side, which then pushes our standards on to know our stuff, to then obviously be ready for questions and everything like that. But I think my next step personally would be to look at more research, and to actually go into some research and use that sort of in the workplace to then obviously push myself on as well.
Brilliant, mate. Really, really appreciate you coming on, Lee. That's been quality, some great information. In terms of people reaching out, if they've got questions or anything like that, do you use social media?
I'm quite quiet on social media, to be fair. I think probably the most active I'll be on is LinkedIn.
Yeah.
So people can shout out to me on LinkedIn if they want to. Just Lee Stafford.
Perfect. Lee, thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.